Hey everybody, welcome to episode 2 of our Pixel Platformer. In this episode, we're going to get some movement happening with our player. We left off last time, we don't have anything going on with our player currently. Just drops down due to its rigid body and sits there on the box collider of our platform. So we're going to create some code here. But before we do that, we're going to add a specific empty game object here to our player. So notice it's childed to my player. We're going to call this ground check. Okay, and these types of checks, sometimes there's wall checks, ceiling checks, are put at the specific location of our player. So for our capsule here, I'm going to put it down right at the feet here. And we're going to use this to draw a little circle, and it's going to check if it's colliding with what we define as the layer ground. And we'll be setting that up in first in code, and then we'll see how it works in our game. So we need our ground check there. And so let's put our code now on our player. So back to our player here. We haven't changed anything so far. We're going to add a C# script here. We're going to call this player movement. Okay, we're going to add and create, and we're going to open this up. And initially in this video, we're just going to be setting up moving left and right and the ability to jump with this ground check implemented. So first thing first, we're not going to use the start method at all here. We're going to be creating some variables. So the first one is going to be private. We don't need access to it in the inspector. So under private here, we're going to be typing in a float, and this is going to be our horizontal input. Okay, so we're going to call it exactly what it is, horizontal input. Next thing is going to be public, and this is going to be the float that's going to allow us to control the speed of our player. For now, let's set that equal to 8. We're also going to need the jumping power, so another public float here, and being public will allow you to adjust it. We're going to call this jumping power, and let's try 15 for now. See how that works out. Okay, what else do we need? So we're going to need a couple extra things that I'm going to add now for our ground check. So for our ground check, we're going to need these things to be public as well. So public, and first we're going to need access to our rigid body 2D. So we're going to reference that in the inspector, just call that RB. And now for our ground check, like I was saying, we're going to need to access that game object, the ground check, and we want its transform. So we're going to access its transform, and we're just going to call this ground check, the same thing we called it as a child of our player. And we're going to have a couple settings with this. We'll also have what we're going to define a public float to be the radius of this ground check that we're going to do. It's going to draw a circle, and we're going to call this the check radius. Okay, and we'll set that again in the inspector. And we're also going to need to reference what layer is going to be defined as ground. So this is going to be a public layer mask, and we'll call this just ground layer. Okay. And that should suffice. That should be everything that we're going to need to start coding in here. Okay, so in our update runs every single frame. So this code will run every frame, and what we want to have in here is any inputs. So it's general practice to put to access any inputs in your update so that they don't get missed. Okay, so we're going to be setting our horizontal input float value. That was the first one we defined, and that's going to be what we're getting from the player. So input.get, we're going to be using, get button down. Okay, because we're going to be using Unity's input manager, and what it's called is horizontal. Make sure you spell this perfectly with capital H, and it's going to return, apologies, not get button down, that's for jump. We want to do get axis because the horizontal is an axis, and we want get axis raw, and that's going to return negative or positive, one depending which direction. Left is negative, right is positive. So we're going to just store that for now. And we're going to now need to apply that to the rigid body. So we're going to do that in the fixed update. So private void fixed update. And this is where we apply any physics. So we're going to grab the rigid body and we're going to set its velocity. Okay, so this is a great way to move players, especially in 2D. We're going to be creating a new vector 2, so it needs two parameters. It needs a velocity in the x and in the y direction. So we're going to access our horizontal input. We're going to multiply that by the speed, because remember the input is just positive or negative 1. And the y, we're just going to use whatever is currently the velocity in the y direction. That way we can actually control the movement in air and it won't disrupt our height, okay, our up and down. So this is going to work just fine for us to move our character around. Now, next, we're going to need to be able to jump. Now, first, let's do the ground check. So what we're also going to need here, I forgot to add in our ground, was a public bool. And we're going to make it public just so we can see it in the inspector. Doesn't necessarily need to be public. But this public bool is going to be called isGrounded. And basically, it's just going to return true if we are currently touching the ground and false if we're in the air. So we're going to define this isGrounded, and we'll set that equal to false as default. And in our update, we're going to be checking if we are grounded every single frame. So isGrounded is going to get updated. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to use a class called physics2d. Okay, and in our physics2d, we're going to be drawing what's called an overlap circle. Okay, so this overlap circle needs three parameters. It needs first the location. So we're going to use the ground check dot position. So that's going to access its position, and now it's going to draw a circle, but we need to define the radius. So we're going to call that, we're going to use our check radius for that. And then it wants to know, hey, what layer are we calling ground? So layer mask, we called it ground layer is what we called it, ground layer. Okay, so that's going to be our ground check there. We're going to see how that works in Unity shortly. So it'll return true if we were on the ground. So now we're going to be setting up an if statement, because we can't just press jump and it always works. We have to also be grounded. So first we're going to be checking the input, and this one would be get button down. Okay, so we're going to choose get button down, and this one is defined with capital J for jump, and we're going to do a double ampersand, and that's going to be saying, well, we need two conditions to be true, and so isGrounded needs to be true for us to be able to jump. So let's now add a little, now we're going to be, again, updating our physics here. We don't need to do it in the fixed update because this is just applying an instant force here. It's not a button that we are holding down longer like we do with movement. So here we go. All we need to do is a really simple line of code. We're going to update the rigid body velocity again, and we're going to make a new vector 2, and what's going to happen here is we just want to copy whatever the current x velocity is, but our y is going to be redefined to be jumping power. Okay, so that's going to be our new y value there. Okay, and now that should work. We should be able to jump, and it should only jump when we are grounded. So let's go back into Unity, take a second for it to update the scripts here. And everything should work, but let's try it here. And we're going to be definitely making some adjustments in the inspector, and so will you, to get your player working exactly how you want it to. So first thing first, let's check out this piece of code we just entered, and we need to fill in some of its references. So rigid body, we need to reference that for our player. We also need the ground check transform, so I'm going to grab that over here and drag that in. The radius, I recommend setting it to 0.2, and our ground layer, we don't have a layer called ground yet. We haven't defined it yet. You're going to notice this ground and all these platforms, if we look at the inspector, their layer is default. So you're going to click on that. We're going to add a new layer, and we're going to call this one ground. Then we're going to go back to our ground, and you can hold Control, select the ground and all 3 platforms, and we're going to set that layer to ground. Now that we've created this layer, you can go back to your player, and let's switch this ground layer to be ground. So now it's going to be drawing that circle to check if at our ground check location right here, it's going to draw a little circle and see if it collides with ground. And if that does occur, it'll return true and we'll be able to jump. So let's go back to our player here. Okay, and we're just going to take a close look at what's going on here in our player movement. Now, I know from previous, you're going to want to update your gravity scale because it's going to be really floaty jump at first, and maybe you want that. So I'll leave the gravity scale at 1, and you're going to see how this looks. But adjusting the gravity scale allows us to stop the jump from being so floaty, which is not common in most games. So if I can move left to right here, that's working well. I'm using my arrow keys, and my jump you can see is whoa, super floaty. So, and I'm sticking to the walls. So we're going to need to fix 2 problems here. Way too floaty of a jump, and I'm sticking. So I know exactly what we need to do for this. Gravity scale, I'm going to up that to 3. You can play around with that number. I was okay with the speed, and we'll test the jumping power here. And also, let's stop sticking to our walls. We don't want that to happen. And to do that, we're going to create a 2D physics material here. So we're going to go under Create 2D, and we want the physics material here. We're going to call this Slippery. Okay, and then you're going to access that and change the friction to 0. Okay, once we do that, we can go back to our player and take our slippery physics material and apply it to the collider. Now I'm not going to be able to stick to those platforms, and let's see what our new gravity of 3 looks like. We might need to adjust our jump. Let's see. Okay, moving left to right, that seems to be pretty responsive. And there's our jump. I can get just on top, and you notice that every jump is exactly the same. If I release it quick or hold it, it doesn't change my jump whatsoever. And I cannot infinitely jump. The ground check is working, and you can notice it down here in the inspector. As soon as I leave the ground, it gets unchecked right there. So everything's working great. So feel free, this is the time when you want to make any adjustments, but of course we haven't even drawn our full detailed map. So just get it to how you like it. You can play around with the gravity, and in the next video, I'm going to show you how to implement a variable jump and how to flip our sprite, which we're going to need once we bring in some artwork. All right, we'll see you next time.